40,000 seasoned Ottoman soldiers who had fought in many harsh wars crossed the sea and reached a small island in the center of the Mediterranean with a single clear purpose: to wipe the Knights of St. John from the face of the earth and open the path that would one day lead toward Rome and the lands beyond. And while their force stood mighty and proud with hundreds of ships, heavy cannons, and 6,000 elite janissaries who carried reputations of never knowing defeat, the defenders on the island were only a few hundred knights supported by local villagers and hired fighters who could not hope to match the vast numbers facing them. Yet these few men refused to bend, because they saw Malta not as a simple rock, but as a final line of defense in a world that was shifting and filled with danger. And when we look back to that summer of 1565, we find a clash shaped by courage, discipline, and sheer determination that held against odds no one believed possible. Even today, when one studies a map, Malta appears tiny, almost too small to matter, but in truth that island sat at a crossroads where major sea routes linked Europe with the Middle East, and whoever controlled that position gained the power to influence trade, travel, and war across the entire region. So during the 1500s, Malta became a prized stronghold, and the last barrier to the growing reach of the Ottoman Empire, which sought to push deeper into western lands after losing their home on Rhodes in 1522 and then losing Tripoli in 1551. The Knights, also called the Knights Hospitaller, needed a new base to continue their sworn duty, and Emperor Charles granted them Malta in 1530, and they embraced it as their final refuge, and worked as if every stone would one day be tested by fire. For 30 years they dug, reinforced, and reshaped the island into a fortress system that grew stronger each season. Their order mixed the calm faith of monks with the hard steel spirit of warriors, and they created their own code, their own laws, and even their own navy. And though their motto spoke of defending faith and helping the poor, their actions at sea were far from gentle, because they targeted Ottoman ships, disrupted trade, rescued captives, and struck fear into merchants who sailed under the crescent flag. Their Grandmaster Jean Parasot de Valette, already an old man in his 70s, had lived through endless battles against the same empire, and had become a symbol of resolve and grit for the knights under his command. They carried out actions they called guerre de course, a form of legal sea raiding that hit Ottoman and even Venetian ships when they worked with the enemy, and these raids brought treasure, prisoners, and pride, but they also brought trouble, because the Ottoman court grew angrier each time a prized vessel failed to return, and the final spark came when the knights captured a huge merchant ship owned by the Sultan's chief eunuch, who held great influence in the empire. And at that moment, the insult turned personal, and the Sultan demanded a response. So the Ottomans assembled a massive invasion fleet with 200 warships, 70 large cannons, and up to 40,000 men, including the feared janissaries. And when that armada landed on Malta in 1565, it marked one of the largest military undertakings of its age. Leading the force were two commanders: Mustafa Pasha, a veteran of countless land campaigns, steady and methodical, and Piali Pasha, a younger, ambitious admiral who trusted naval strength and hugged the coast with strategy shaped by the sea. Their ways often clashed, and their disagreements wasted precious time. Once they reached Malta, as each man sought to prove his vision correct, and into this uneasy partnership arrived Dragut, the legendary corsair whose name caused dread across the Mediterranean, for he had spent decades raiding coasts, defeating fleets, and shaping naval warfare like few others. And though the two Pashas welcomed him in appearance, both feared his power and fame, and worried he would overshadow them. Dragut supported the idea of striking Fort St. Elmo first, a small but important star-shaped fort guarding the main harbors, and though it was never designed to handle a full siege, its location forced the Ottomans to take it before moving deeper onto the island. The landing itself took 10 days, as the heavy guns had to be brought ashore and carried into place, and once the siege began, St. Elmo endured countless bombardments, with thousands of shots hammering its walls each day. But Grandmaster de Valette saw the fort as a tool to buy time, so he created a brutal night rotation, sending fresh fighters and supplies across the harbor after dark while removing the wounded, and this cycle allowed the small garrison to survive far longer than expected, and what should have lasted a week dragged into more than a month, even as the fort crumbled around the men inside. During the siege, Dragut was struck and killed, either by fire from the defenders or by accident within his own ranks, and his death shook the Ottoman army because he had been one of their greatest minds, and without him the tension among the commanders grew worse. By late June the fort was little more than broken stone, yet the defenders kept fighting until almost all had fallen, and on June 23 the Ottomans finally entered St. Elmo, but the victory cost them 6,000 men, including many of their finest troops, and instead of Weakening the knights, the sacrifice hardened their resolve. When the Ottomans offered terms of surrender to end the bloodshed, de Valette refused because he knew that a single thought of peace would crumble the courage of his people, and instead he focused on morale, understanding that fear fed on idleness, so he pushed every man, woman and child to work repairing walls, moving supplies, and holding positions to prevent despair from spreading through the towns. And to make surrender impossible in the minds of his people, he ordered all Ottoman prisoners to be executed, and chose civilians to carry out the act, believing that once blood was shared there would be no turning back, and though the choice was harsh, it united the defenders and locked them into a fight of no return. The fall of St. Elmo brought terrible loss to the knights, with nearly 1,500 defenders killed or dying, but it also inflicted deep wounds upon the Ottomans, who had expected a swift victory and now faced a long struggle against an enemy whose spirit had become stronger, not weaker. After the fall of St. Elmo, the Ottomans believed the rest of Malta would soon collapse, yet they did not understand that the twin strongholds of Birgu, also called Vittoriosa, and Sanglia, known proudly by the defenders as the unconquered city, were unlike any simple medieval fort, for they were shaped by the newest ideas of European military engineering, designed with angled walls, thick ramparts, and deep ditches that could absorb heavy cannon fire and create deadly overlapping fields of defense. And these bastions were set so each wall protected the others, turning the area into a layered shield that made any direct approach a nightmare for invading forces. The knights had prepared these defenses for decades, since the day they first arrived on the island, and they placed great trust in the low, wide structures of the Tres Italienne style, which relied on geometry, brute strength, and careful positioning, instead of tall walls that once impressed foes but now crumbled before gunpowder. Yet even with such defenses, the knights needed creativity to survive, and their leaders turned the siege into a living experiment in defense and survival. They knew the Ottomans planned to strike Sanglia from the sea, hoping to use the harbor to bypass the heaviest guns from Fort St. Angelo, so the knights stretched a massive iron chain across the water between Birgu and Sanglia, a floating barrier that waited for any daring assault, and beneath the surface they planted rows of pointed wooden stakes, hidden traps ready to tear into Ottoman boats when the attackers tried a bold move, dragging nearly 100 boats across the narrow peninsula to come down from the opposite side. The hidden stakes and the chain shattered their plan before it could unfold, showing that the knights had thought through every watery angle of the fight. And this was not the only surprise waiting for the invaders, because the Ottomans brought siege towers, tall wooden machines covered in soaked hides, to block fire arrows, and built with drawbridges ready to drop onto the walls, and they used wheeled shelters to push infantry closer under protection. But the knights and the Maltese engineers dug tunnels beneath the ground, countermines that let them collapse towers from below or erupt directly under enemy lines, and within those dark tunnels men battled in choking dust with picks and shovels and bare hands in one of the most brutal forms of combat, hidden from the sun, and never recorded in fine detail, but essential to the struggle on the surface. The defenders also used a water and drainage system beneath their cities, more advanced than many European towns of that era, which helped keep the forts dry despite constant bombardment, and tunneling the dry ground kept morale higher and allowed the walls to hold longer while disease was kept at bay, and the knights hid cannons behind false brick fronts, waiting for the perfect moment. And when Ottoman siege towers rolled close, they fired chain-shot, 2 iron balls linked together that tore through wood and flesh, ripping the towers apart in seconds and wasting weeks of Ottoman labor. As the siege neared late August, the mighty Ottoman force that arrived with pride and confidence began to weaken from within, because their sprawling camps set near marshlands turned into a breeding ground for sickness. In the dry, scorching Maltese summer, stagnant pools, rotting waste, and thousands of bodies packed tightly fed fevers and dysentery. And the Ottoman medical care was not enough to control the spreading illness. Men who had stood against cannon and steel now fell helpless in the mud, and though the Ottoman numbers remained huge, the heart of the army was slowly breaking. Meanwhile, inside the fortified cities, the knights managed their supplies better, boiled water, cleaned their quarters, and rotated the sick away from fresh troops, which gave them an unexpected advantage, even while cornered and outnumbered. And by early August the Ottomans were desperate to finish the siege, and on the 7th Mustafa Pasha ordered a massive assault on Birgu that he believed would finally crush the defense. Waves of Janissaries climbed the walls again and again, and for hours the outcome hung in balance, with smoke, dust, and shouting filling the air as defenders struggled to hold back the famous infantry of the empire. Yet at the height of the attack, fate shifted when a small mounted force from Dinah, led by Captain Vincenzo Anastasi, burst into the Ottoman rear, not at the front lines but at their field hospital, killing dozens of wounded soldiers and staff, and the shock sent chaos through the camp, because rumors spread instantly that a relief army from Sicily had arrived, the long-awaited force called the Grand Associé, and fear gripped the attackers, who already felt their strength fading, believing they would soon be caught between two enemies. The great assault collapsed, and the Ottomans pulled back, leaving the field covered with their dead. From then on, fear spread through their ranks, and the knights took every chance to press that fear. When Mustafa later thought of pulling his troops inland to rest for winter, the small inland town of Medina bluffed with a roar of cannon fire, even though they had few supplies and even fewer defenders, and the Ottomans believed the city was brave, strong, and ready. So Mustafa decided not to risk another drawn-out fight, and turned away. And while all this unfolded across the sea, the relief force that the people of Malta prayed for finally began to move. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy of Sicily, had held back his army, waiting for the right moment, perhaps hoping the siege would weaken the Ottomans enough that his intervention would break them for good. His relief army, which numbered between 8,000 and 10,000 men, set sail in early September, and carried the hopes of Malta on its banners. When they landed on the northern coast of the island, their arrival felt like a miracle, and the sight lifted the spirits of every battered defender, and crushed the last hopes of the Ottoman commanders, because their men were sick, exhausted, and losing faith, as September brought the coming storm season that threatened their fleet if they stayed too long. So on the 8th of September, after more than 3 months of endless struggle, the Ottomans began to withdraw from their positions, their grand army reduced by disease, hunger, and failed assaults, and they headed back to their ships, leaving Malta battered but unbroken, and the once invincible aura of the Ottoman Empire cracked on those sun-baked cliffs as Europe watched amazed at the impossible defense. When the last Ottoman ships pulled away from Malta after months of violent struggle, the defenders looked across a landscape that seemed almost unrecognizable from the world they had known before the siege. The walls were cracked, the ground scorched, and the air still heavy with smoke and dust, yet the people who remained felt a strength inside them that came from surviving a force that the rest of Europe had feared for generations. And as the wounded were carried to safety, and the dead were gathered for burial, the Grandmaster Jean Parasot de Valette understood that this victory, though miraculous, had not ended the danger, because the Ottoman Empire still possessed great armies and a vast navy, and he reasoned that as soon as they recovered they might return with even greater numbers. So even while the cheers of celebration rose from the battered fortresses, he began to think of the next step. He knew the island must be made stronger than ever, and he chose the very ground that had nearly fallen during the siege, the rocky peninsula where Fort St. Elmo had stood, and where so many knights had died buying time for the rest of Malta. There, he planned to build a new city, a fortress that would not simply defend the island, but transform it into a bastion that would stand firm against any future threat. On March of 1566, less than 1 year after the siege, the first stone was set for a new capital that would bear his name, Valletta, and it rose quickly from the same rocky ridge that had been soaked with the blood of defenders and attackers alike. Engineers, architects, and laborers worked with purpose, building walls shaped by the latest designs of the Tres Italienne, the strong angular geometry that turned stone into a weapon of survival. Each bastion was placed so it could support the others, creating a net of force that would deflect cannon fire and funnel enemies into deadly ground. And the streets themselves were arranged in straight lines rising upward so that cool sea air would move through the city, and smoke from battle or fire would drift away easily. And Valletta became both a home and a fortress, a place that offered safety but also reminded every inhabitant of the price paid to keep the island free. The story of this new city spread far and wide across Europe, and nations that had once hesitated to resist the expanding Ottoman reach now saw the Siege of Malta as proof that the empire could be stopped. The knights who had survived the ordeal were hailed as heroes, and their tale was repeated in taverns, courts, and churches, inspiring many who had grown weary of endless conflict. Even though the knights had stood with barely a few thousand men against an army nearly 10 times larger, they had shown that courage, discipline, and clever thinking could break even the mightiest invader, and this victory helped plant the seeds of cooperation among European states that rarely trusted one another because fear of the Ottomans had long overshadowed their rivalries. But now hope returned, and with it a belief that unity might finally turn the tide. The years following the siege saw growing conversations among leaders who had once kept their distance, as they realized the Mediterranean needed a coalition bold enough to take a stand. And by 1571, only 6 years after the siege, a new alliance known as the Holy League rose from these discussions, uniting Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and several smaller powers, and this coalition agreed to build a combined fleet that could challenge the Ottoman Empire on the sea where its influence had long been strongest. Each member committed ships, sailors, and resources, forming an armada unlike any seen in recent decades, and the memory of Malta hung over the alliance like a guiding flame, reminding them that the Ottomans were not invincible and could be defeated when faced with determination and unified strength, and so the Holy League sailed toward a meeting that would shape the future of the Mediterranean for generations to come. The Battle of Lepanto, a clash that involved hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, and the hopes of many who longed for peace after years of fear and loss. Though this battle stood outside the shores of Malta, its roots grew from the courage shown during the siege, because the victory on that small island helped inspire the leaders of Europe to take bold action that they had once believed impossible. At Lepanto, the combined fleet of the Holy League fought with resolve and coordination that surprised even seasoned commanders, and when the tide turned against the Ottomans, their defeat echoed across the sea, weakening the empire further and giving Christian powers renewed confidence. And though the Ottomans remained a formidable force for many years after Lepanto, these back-to-back setbacks, Malta and then Lepanto, marked a turning point that slowed their advance and shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Yet while Europe celebrated these larger victories, the people of Malta continued to rebuild their home and strengthen the new capital of Valletta. Each wall, each street, and each building rose from the sweat of laborers who remembered the siege not just as a historical moment, but as a personal memory, because nearly every family on the island had lost someone or had fought in some way to protect their land, and these memories became part of the identity of the city itself, an unbroken spirit carved into stone. Tourists and travelers in later centuries often marveled at Valletta, calling it a fortress built by gentlemen for gentlemen, yet beneath its elegant facades and straight roads lay the story of a desperate fight for survival, a fight shaped by fear, hope, sacrifice, and astonishing resolve. For the knights who remained, it was not only a home but a symbol of purpose, reminding them daily of their vow to defend the faith and serve the poor. And though the order itself would change over time, the echo of their greatest stand never faded, and the legend of the siege continued to grow, passed down through stories, songs, and chronicles that preserved the memory of how a small island in the vast blue sea became the place where an empire was stopped and the future of Europe was reshaped. And every stone of Valletta whispered that tale, even centuries after the smoke of battle had drifted away. In the years that followed the siege, the island of Malta stood as a living reminder of how determination and unity could overturn the plans of a force once believed unstoppable, and travelers who reached its shores often felt as if they were stepping onto sacred ground shaped by the memory of a struggle that had echoed across the world. The narrow streets, the strong walls, and the quiet harbors all seemed to carry the breath of that summer when thousands had fought and died for control of a place that looked small on maps but held enormous meaning in the great contest of empires. And as Valletta continued to rise, the story of the siege spread from one kingdom to another, stirring reflections on human courage and the strange mix of fear and hope that had held the defenders together during the darkest hours when many believed all would be lost. And for scholars, chroniclers, and sailors, the sight of the fortified capital became proof that even in an age shaped by cannons, fire, and massive armies, the will of a small community could withstand giants. And one could see in the faces of the people who lived there a kind of inherited strength born from parents, grandparents, and distant relatives who had carried stones, rebuilt walls, and risked their lives when the Ottomans pressed from every side. The Knights of St. John continued their mission on the island long after the siege ended, guarding sea routes and offering a refuge to travelers who came from many corners of the world. And though the order would change through time, and the political shape of Europe would shift with new alliances and new conflicts, the spirit of the Knights remained tied to the defense of Malta, which they saw not simply as a strategic base but as a symbol of everything they fought for. Their victory in 1565 became one of the great tales of resistance, retold in courts, written in books, and honored by leaders who admired how a few hundred soldiers, supported by villagers and mercenaries, had outlasted an empire that commanded thousands upon thousands. The story gained special meaning among sailors who traveled through the Mediterranean, because the sea after all had carried both danger and deliverance during those long months when supplies moved by night across the harbor to Fort St. Elmo, and later brought the angels of hope in the form of the Sicilian relief force that finally turned the tide. Poets and storytellers later compared the siege to a storm that battered a cliff again and again, only to break against the hard rock that refused to fall. And this image stayed within European memory as a reflection of resilience and unity in an age where kingdoms often quarreled, but could still come together when the threat grew too great. The people of Malta themselves carried the story with pride, teaching it to their children, so that each new generation would understand what had been sacrificed to protect the island from becoming a stepping stone for conquests that might have reached far into the west and shaped a different world entirely. Historians also pointed out that the siege had long-lasting influence on the Mediterranean because the heavy losses suffered by the Ottomans weakened their aura of invincibility and forced them to reckon with the limits of their power, while encouraging European states to build coalitions that had once seemed impossible. And though battles would continue in later years and the struggle for influence at sea would rise and fall with the tides, the Siege of Malta stood as a turning point marked by bravery and strategic insight, and this helped frame future decisions among rulers who now understood the importance of unified action against threats that crossed borders and oceans. Over time, Valletta became more than a fortress. It became a cultural beacon with grand buildings, hospitals, palaces, and churches that carried the marks of European art and architecture. But at its core, the city always served as a fortress of memory, a living monument to the men and women who had labored under fire, who had fought at the walls, who had held wounded comrades, and who had refused to surrender when all signs pointed to doom. Travelers from distant lands often wrote of the strange feeling they experienced while walking through the gates of Valletta, because the walls, though silent, seemed alive with stories and whispers from a century that had nearly torn the island apart. Yet those same walls also spoke of renewal, of courage, and of the belief that even small places could shape the destiny of nations. Many chroniclers noted that the legacy of the siege did not belong only to the Knights or the Maltese, but to all who believed in standing firm when the world seemed ready to collapse. And so the tale found a home in the hearts of people across Europe, and even beyond. As the centuries passed, the island endured new rulers and new challenges, yet the memory of 1565 remained untouched by time because it had carved itself deeply into the identity of the land and its people. And visitors who listened to local guides or read the ancient chronicles sensed that the siege, though long gone, remained present in every stone of Valletta and every shadow cast by its strong walls. And this enduring presence reminded all who came that history is not merely a record of dates and battles, but a living force shaped by the actions of those who refused to break under pressure. The Siege of Malta endured in art, maps, songs, and stories passed from one age to another. And though the world around the island changed again and again, the heart of its tale continued to beat with the same message of courage, ingenuity, unity, and sacrifice. And when the sun sets over Valletta, casting long golden bands of light across its bastions, one can almost feel the echo of distant voices, the clash of steel, the cries of battle, and the unyielding hope that carried the defenders through the longest summer of their lives. And thus the Siege of Malta remains one of those rare moments when the fate of nations turned upon a handful of people who believed that holding their ground, even against impossible odds, could change the shape of the world. And for that reason the story continues to inspire those who learn it, reminding each new generation that even a small island standing alone in the wide sea can become a beacon of strength when courage guides the hearts of its people.